Good afternoon. Thank you for joining us. If you just tuned in, my name is Rebecca Sharp. I'm an archives specialist, and I provide reference services at the National Archives in Washington, D.C. I have a few items to go over just before we get started. You can submit your questions for a speaker via Twitter using hashtag GenFair2014, or you can submit a question on YouTube chat. The speaker may not be able to answer all of your questions during the allotted 10-minute Q&A session. For captioning, go to the FAIR website and click on the link for today. The lectures will be recorded and available on the FAIR website by the end of November. If you're just tuning in and following the schedule, this next lecture is Lecture 14, and it's entitled Individual Deceased Personnel File. Our speaker is Bryan K. McGraw. This presentation will highlight the Air Force and Navy mortuary and casualty files maintained by the National Archives at St. Louis, detailing the Individual Deceased Personnel File, IDPF for short, which are available to the public. The lecture will also include an overview of the information and documents typically found in these files. Procedures will also be explained for how to access these records for both on-site and off-site researchers. Bryan is an access coordinator and the director of the National Archives at St. Louis, Missouri. And I am turning the microphone over to you, Bryan.
Thank you, Rebecca. And good afternoon to all of you in Eastern time zones and points east, and good morning to those of us still in Central and points west. I'm Bryan McGraw, and I'm very happy to be able to spend a little time with you today talking about a collection of records that we have here in St. Louis at the National Archives that I have a personal connection with because while not among the records that I'm going to talk about here today, but in records of a newer period, I actually created some of these records serving as a mortuary officer in the Air Force in the 1980s and 1990s. So I'm going to give you the overview of these records, but I'm also going to try to give you a little perspective into some of the things that went into creating these records and some of the stories behind the documents. So on slide 4, my agenda, I'm going to talk about what an IDPF really is and discuss some of the information about the record series so you can make an informed request. I'll also discuss the function, use, the scope and content of the material, the arrangement and how to locate a record. I'll also talk about some of the access restrictions since they're personal data series records and how you can get that material, and then of course Q&A at the end. So moving on to slide 5, an IDPF is a personnel file that's created by a military service branch that documents the actions taken when someone is killed in the service. In the Air Force, they're called mortuary files. In the Navy and Marine Corps, they can also be called casualty files. And the National Archives here in St. Louis has the legal custody of these records of the Air Force, the Navy, and the Marine Corps, which are combined. And the Army records we expect to receive in the very near future. Those records are currently being digitized by the Army to help resolve open MIA cases from World War II, Korea. And as soon as that work is finished, those records will be transferred here. So a question that's often asked, why are these permanent records? From a standpoint of genealogy and various research, they are extremely beneficial because they have a variety of information that is useful in conducting that research, whether it's for family history, for historic or academic reasons. Another reason for some of these, specifically the Air Force records, they can contain some surrogate material for the OMPFs, the official military personnel files, that were lost in the 1973 fire. Again, this would only be for those individual airmen that were killed, not for those that survived. Next slide, please. The Air Force IDPF I'm going to talk about first, and then I'll discuss the Navy and Marine Corps records. The series title is listed there, again called the Mortuary Files. The citation, Records of the U.S. Air Force Commands, Activities and Organizations, Record Group 342, maintained here in St. Louis. These are not yet in the online public access catalog. We're working to do that, but we will still be able to find these for you if you need them. These records run from 1940 through 1973 and comprise 273 cubic feet. That's a small collection, small for us in the scheme of things here in St. Louis. The creating agency, of course, is the Air Force through the Department of Defense, major commands, installations by a particular wing or group organizationally, and then, of course, Record Group 342. Now, at the bottom of the slide, I have a bullet there talking about the nuances of this because, as I'm sure most of you know, the Air Force was part of the Army in the early days prior to its own establishment as a separate service in 1947. So from 1940 through mid-September of 1947, they were part of the Army, specifically the Army Air Corps for the period 1926 into June of 41, and then later the Army Air Forces from June of 41 until the establishment of the Air Force. So while these records were created and of that period will have Army documents in them because that's the parent service, they were subsumed into the Record Group 342 Air Force collection. You will also notice, as you look at these records, those older ones, the governing regulations and directives on the activities that were performed came from Army Regulation 30-1820, whereas when the Air Force was established, they came from Air Force Regulation 143-1. Going on to slide 7, information on the function and use. As I mentioned, these were created when someone was killed. It didn't matter if they were killed in an accident, in combat, by their own means. If they died, there was a record created. And it documents all the actions taken to take care of the remains and get them to their final resting point. Interesting in this design is the fact that there are largely 2 roles performed. One as the mortuary officer, which was a permanent position established at the base level, wing, or installation, and that person would spring into action when something happened and would be responsible for basically recovering the body, making a positive identification, and then, of course, making all the arrangements for the final internment. Concurrently, a summary court officer was appointed, and this was someone that was selected from the unit that the individual came from that was deceased. And that person was largely responsible for taking care of the personal effects. So closing out the bank accounts and all the financial matters, as well as even things like closing out the locker at the gym and returning the key, things of that nature. So anything and everything associated with the person's effects. Because in the overwhelming majority of these cases, this was unexpected. And so things were left as if things were, he was still alive. So the summary court officer had a lot to do in a very short period of time. So these 2 individuals worked together. And so when you look at the files of the Air Force, and especially in the 1950s forward, you see that the file is arranged typically with mortuary actions in one section, and another section would contain the summary court-martial documents. As I mentioned, these can be used for those Air Force records that were lost in the 1973 fire at the National Personnel Records Center. And again, those are records, and you'll hear more about this in the next presentation from Teresa Fitzgerald, but Air Force personnel with the last names Hubbard through the letter Z that were discharged, left the service, died in service, in this case, 1947 to 1963. Approximately 75% of those records were lost. So if a mortuary record exists for one of those individuals, it can be very helpful in the family history research. As I mentioned, these are an excellent source of genealogical material from things such as obviously the date and place of birth, the date of death, the addresses, the next of kin, beneficiaries, all sorts of things that help paint a picture of this individual's existence on this earth. Moving on to slide 8. The contents of these records vary over time, and this is a common theme not just with the Air Force but with all of these records from the services. In the early periods, these from the 1940s up until the Air Force is established and the Defense Department is established, the records are fairly small in size. And even in cases where normally you would expect to have a lot of documentation, they're fairly succinct. For example, the record of a John Kinney, who was an aircraft pilot, who was killed in a crash in training in Colorado in 1943. The nature of search and recovery operations is very time-consuming, very detailed, and there's a lot of paperwork. But despite all of the things that obviously happened to recover the body, and determine the cause of the accident and such. There's really not that much material. Comparing that to a record from the 1960s, for example, of someone who was killed in an automobile accident, that record is much larger, even though the circumstances of the death were much simpler. Some things that are also in the record is a variety of correspondence. And so you will see the official notifications, correspondence to and from the next of kin, are obviously things like personal effects inventories, things that the individual had to return that were property of the Air Force or of someone else. And then, of course, you begin to see forms established over time. So prior to 1948, Army forms, Army templates and such, and then after that, after the establishment of the Air Force, they become Air Force forms and Department of Defense forms. You also will have death certificates. That's a staple in all of these records. Divorce decrees, if it's applicable. Obviously, marriage and birth certificates, once again, to establish the next of kin. The first thing that occurred after the notification was to determine who is the next of kin. So who is the person that's going to make the decisions regarding the remains. So that is a very important piece in these, and so that's very good for determining the lineage. There's also death notices, various orders and things, anything and everything having to do with recovering the remains, identifying conclusively who they are, and then all through the disposition and internment. So you will see a variety of forms. Many of these forms are still used today by the Air Force. Air Force Form 9 is a procurement form, but it's one that's used for contract mortuary services. You may see those in there. Checklists for deaths occurring in the CONUS, continental United States, and another one that also exists for OCONUS, outside the United States. And of course, the Air Force Form 715, which is a preparation room history report. And I've got some examples that I'll show you in just a few moments. Moving to slide 9. From an arrangement perspective, each of these records, of course, is unique, and they are filed alphabetically by the individual and the year of death. So to locate one of these records, the researchers need to provide the name of the person. The full name is very beneficial, and the date of death. If you know the exact date, that's very helpful, but even if you get it into the right year, we can usually work with that. And it's also important to know where that individual served, what type of, if you know the base where they served, or if you know the major command that they were part of. For example, if they were a B-47 pilot and crashed, that is a bomber, and so that would have been under Strategic Air Command. If they were an F-101 fighter pilot, that would have been Tactical Air Command. So you may have to do a little research, but if you know the installation, that will usually help paint the picture, and we can locate it, because once again, that's how the records were filed and how they've come to us. I mentioned that these are personal data series records, and as a result, we have to screen them for some information that we cannot release by law under the privacy exemption to FOIA, and most notably, that's third-party social security numbers and addresses, because we don't know conclusively if the other parties that may be identified in these records are deceased or not, and as well if there's certain criminal or deviant behavior that could cause embarrassment to any surviving family members. That information would have to be redacted for a period up to 100 years, and then after that, it's typically releasable. Moving on to slide 10, I've got some examples here, and I realize you may not be able to see these that clearly. I apologize, but of course you can certainly come here to St. Louis. It's a great town. We have great baseball in spite of what happened last night, and we'll be happy to show you these records. But this is an example of one of the forms that was used early on, and this is what we call a report of disposition of remains. And it's basically a summary. It's a document template which was typed on a typewriter. This is from the period of when they were under the Army. This is from 1943. And it really just summarizes kind of it gives an overview in the top portion of the nature of the death, and then lists the various expenses and the costs associated with the preparation of remains, with all the things necessary to get the individual buried. So that would vary from case to case and location to location, but that's a typical document found in some of the early records. Continuing on to slide 11, this is a document which is a typed narrative instruction. In later years, this would be on a form, and it would be a little more standardized, but nonetheless, it's still something that's used today. And this is an instruction for the escort. The escort is the military service member that would accompany the remains to its final resting place, to wherever the next of kin desires that to be. And the escort is someone that typically, with few exceptions, was from the same unit, had the same rank as the deceased, same gender, race, even the same specialty. So if they were a aircraft mechanic and they were a white male of, say, Polish descent, there's a good possibility if the unit had someone that fit that description of the deceased, that person would be the escort. Not always, but that was generally the rule, and that was to ease the burden on the family, because this person is the individual outside of the mortuary officer or the casualty officer and the chaplain, the individual that the family is going to have conversations with as they are making the final internment. So they were responsible for getting the body from the Air Force Base, or from the location, to its final resting place. And so these instructions are very specific, and of course, there's some things in here I just want to point out that's very typical. An excerpt from it, about halfway down on the page: the attendant will conduct himself as a gentleman, will not impart himself upon the family in any way, and accept their offers as to sleeping accommodations with gracious thanks, and will do all this in the power to keep the high regard for the service that is prevalent in the minds of citizens, but being the only representative of the Army. So they have to conduct themselves. They're on notice, and this was not easy duty, especially if the escort was someone that knew the deceased, or even in some cases may have known the family. So, but these are instructions that they were provided. They were briefed, and in later years, not only would the mortuary officer at the bottom sign it, but also the escort would acknowledge through his or her signature that they understood and would follow those instructions. The next slide shows the Air Force Form 715, and this is from the 1950s, and it shows basically summarizes the condition of the remains as well as the actions taken to prepare the body. And on the second page, there is a checklist part where that is completed by the person doing the preparations, the embalming or such, as well as potentially the coroner or forensic pathologist, and then it's signed off by the mortuary officer who is there and present for these actions to make sure things were done properly in accordance with the Air Force regulations. So in this process, there would be two inspections, one initially here as the body is being prepared, and then another one after the body is finally ready to go, fully dressed in the uniform and all those things, being ready to be shipped and turned over to the escort. So this was very important paperwork to make sure things were done properly. So that's an overview of the Air Force records. Let me switch gears now and talk about, in the next slide, we're going to talk about the Navy and Marine Corps records. And these, while they are from a different branch of service, they are very similar in that they do the same thing that the Air Force records do. Of course, the citation's different. Records of the Bureau of Naval Personnel, Record Group 24, and here in St. Louis. Now, these include Marines as well as Navy, and of course the Marines are a different record group, Record Group 127, but these, when they are become a mortuary file or casualty file, they become part of Record Group 24. The OPA identification numbers are listed there for the online public access, and these records range from 1907 in basically up through 1975, 688 cubic feet, and they are from, of course, the Department of Defense, Department of Navy, Bureau of Navy Personnel, Bureau of Navigation, Record Group 24, and include both Navy and Marine Corps, and in cases of wartime, they would also include the Coast Guard that were mobilized as part of the Navy. Slide 14, we're going to talk about the function and use of these records. Again, these were created when someone was killed while serving, and it documents those actions taken to complete that case. But this is where they kind of differ slightly from the Air Force approach, and it's just a matter of implementation. The actions are the same. They still had to take care of the remains. They still had to close out the bank accounts and all the personal effects and things. But typically in the Navy or the Marine Corps, this was done by one office versus separating those duties out as the Air Force did. So the same types of things occur. The actions are documented in a similar way In later years, using a lot of Department of Defense forms and Department of Navy forms, but in the early days, using a lot of correspondence. It does complement the record of the personnel record that we have on these individuals. And as has been mentioned, I think, in the earlier presentation, the Navy and Marine Corps records were not significantly affected by the fire. I say not significantly because there was, we know, some records, very small number of records, but those were lost in the fire because those were on the desks or in the file areas where the fire occurred on the 6th floor of the building in 1973. But the Marine Corps and Navy records were not stored on that floor where the fire occurred. So only those that were actively being used at that point were affected. They are also, just like the Air Force Ones, an excellent source for genealogical material, listing again date and place of birth, date of death, addresses, next of kin, beneficiary information, and so on. On slide 15, the scope and content, the next area I'm going to talk about. Can we go to slide 15? Thank you. Like the Air Force Ones, these vary. Again, in the early days, from the early parts of the 20th century up in through World War II, these records were fairly small in size. They were not standardized. There was a lot of unique documents in them based upon the particular command or fleet in which the individual was killed. Pacific Fleet versus Atlantic Fleet versus the Mediterranean. There would be some differences there in the correspondence, in the documents, but largely, again, the same actions occur. Again, by the time you get with the establishment of the Defense Department in 1947, and when you get beyond that point, you begin to see a lot more standardization occur in the records, extensive use of forms, and so they become, as well, just like the Air Force records, larger records through time. The contents are similar to the Air Force ones. Correspondence, a tremendous amount of correspondence. The Navy likes to write. I guess if you're on a ship a lot, there's not much to do. But there's a tremendous amount of correspondence going back and forth between various commands, the next of kin, and so forth. There's, of course, personal effects inventory, the standard legal documents, death certificates, decrees, and things of that nature. And you'll also find a tremendous amount of what is called official message traffic. These were things that would be documented on a DD Form 173, which is a form that's used in the Defense Department. It was used extensively to communicate back and forth around the world. So it was a very convenient means to communicate from ship to ship, ship to shore, remote locations and such, and it allowed that information to flow. But it was, again, a very sterile means of communication. And of course, there's other things like claim and vouchers for death gratuity payments. Again, a tremendous amount of forms used in these records. On slide 16, we're going to talk about the arrangement and locating the record. Again, these are deceased members filed alphabetically by the year of death. So in this case, it's good to know, obviously, the full name. The date of death is very important. And if it's a military, if it's a Navy person, it helps to know if that person was on a ship or on a shore installation. And obviously the Marine Corps, if they were in combat role or if they were in a support role. The Marine Corps being a smaller service, it's a little easier to locate some of those known entities. Again, the same access restrictions apply, subject to FOIA, Exemption B6, the third-party socials and addresses, things of that nature, have to be redacted out. And I've got some examples here now, beginning on slide 17, of documents found in these records. Thank you. This is a missing persons report from 1944, and it's a letter from the unit. In this case was a medical department at Martha's Vineyard Airfield, and up off the coast there was an accident, and these Navy personnel were lost at sea. And so this is identifying that these folks are missing at this point, and obviously they were deceased, otherwise they wouldn't be in this file. Each one of these individual sailors had their own file, so this is just one document from one of these records. The next slide, slide 18, is an example of the infamous telegrams that were received and used extensively by the Defense Department. This is a Navy one, again, for the same aircraft accident in October of '44 off Martha's Vineyard, where they are notifying the family that their son was killed in an airplane crash at sea. And again, this is something that's used for decades. We even see this in modern movies. We Were Soldiers, where the Army personnel and their families were receiving these yellow telegrams via the cab company coming in. So it's something that's used extensively, not only at this period, but for years to come. The next slide shows some of the unique types of things that can be found in the record. In fact, this slide and the next one will show that. This was a document from a file of a deceased petty officer who had a child that survived. Unfortunately, both the parents were killed in an automobile accident. And so the Navy had to determine who was going to be the guardian for the minor. The minor was the next of kin, but was obviously not old enough legally to make those decisions. And so who was going to get custody of the child? And so this is some of the communication associated with that, which is essential to know who is going to be determining where the body goes. And that is always a potential hot button topic, because different sides of the family can have different expectations. And so you have to have somebody that is the legal next of kin, and that's the person that calls the shots. And that's just some of the documents associated with that. This one is a guardianship order showing that the child is going to be given to the, from a legal standpoint, custody to the grandparents. The next slide, slide 20, shows the letter that was communicated as a result of the analysis and work done by the Navy and their legal department and so forth. This letter was then sent to the father of the petty officer. He and his wife, in effect the daughter's grandparents, became their legal guardian. And so as a result of that, they were the ones that then were asked to complete various forms, which are listed at the bottom of the document. Veterans Affairs forms for burial, DD Form 1300, which is the death certificate, and so forth. So this is something that is unfortunate, but it has to happen because they have to know who is the legal next of kin. So those are just some examples of some of the documents found in these files. To access these, there's different ways to do that. Obviously, you're welcome to come here to St. Louis and to visit our public research room. I have our phone number listed there, and I have there listed appointments are necessary. And the reason is, when you have personal data series records like we have here, and we have many tens of millions, names are quite common, and we have to make sure that we have the right record. We also have to make sure the record is in a stable enough condition to be able to be served, so that you can review it, scan it, get a copy of it. And we also have to do the screening on it to remove the redactions and things, which is one of the problems that prevent the public from being able to search the records themselves or to review them without that work being done. So we ask you to please contact us in advance. Don't show up at the door. We'll do everything we can to accommodate you, but it may take a while. So our hours are listed there, Tuesday through Friday. And as I mentioned, we have to make sure we have the record, and we get everything scheduled to make your visit a very productive one. It's no cost to view the records. You can scan them with your approved flatbed scanner or with your approved digital camera. And of course, if you want a photocopy, there is a copy fee associated with that. And you can also write to us if you can't make it here, and our address is listed there. And you could just send a letter to us to that address. You can email us at the stl.archives@nara.gov with the information. Again, the full name, the information about the unit, the date of death, those types of things are very important. And we ask that you please, if you are going to purchase a copy, do not send us the money in advance, because we have to make sure we have the record and make sure that everything is in order before we do that. So to wrap up on slide 22, the IDPFs are a rich source of genealogical information, and they complement not only the official military personnel record, but other auxiliary series of records that we have here in St. Louis and at other locations in NARA. And no two of these records are alike. Each one is as unique as the individual that they document. And again, once the Army finishes their project, we will receive those records here. We have room for them in this building, and we will integrate those into this collection and make those available. So we will keep the public updated on this as we progress, and I encourage you to view our web pages from time to time. And also on social media, we will post updates and things there as well. So thank you for your time and attention, and I'll be happy to answer any questions.
Bryan, before we get too serious, I wanted to read one of the comments from one of your audience members. In response to your comment about baseball, they said, rolling on the floor laughing. Tell Bryan McGraw I tip my cap to the Royals. They made a valiant effort last night.
They sure did. They sure did. It was hard as a Cardinal fan losing to the Giants, but we were pulling for the Royals, even though they really didn't win a World Series in 1985. They stole it, but no grudges there. So thank you.
The first question is, did Air Force incident files from December 1942 survive the fires?
These records, these mortuary files that we have here were not here in St. Louis at the National Personnel Records Center when the fire occurred in 1973. The archive here is fairly new. We were established in 2004, and so the records that we have now are a combination of the official military personnel files that were at the NPRC that are co-located with us here in this building, as well as records that have transferred here, and these Air Force records transferred to us well after that period. In 2006, I believe, is when they started coming in. So they were not affected by the...
Your next question. Are the Red Tails or Tuskegee Airmen records included in these records?
Yes, the Tuskegee Airmen records are, part of the military service, so they are among the 57 million military personnel records that we have here in this building.
Thank you, Bryan. That's all your online questions.
Okay.
If the speaker did not get to your question, please send an email to inquire@nara.gov. We will now have a short intermission.